Hello, and welcome to Chapter 2 of Plant Science, AGRO110. Today we're going to talk about crop origin, naming, and classification of our crops. We're going to talk about how we can slice and dice these crops into talking about these in different ways. We can talk about them in terms of their climatic adaptation, whether they're cold hardy or not, their agronomic use, how we use them as a crop, their life cycle, their botanical classification, which we kind of have already covered there. We can talk about their place of origin, their leaf retention characteristics, and their stem growth characteristics, for instance, herbaceous versus woody. Well, let's start off by talking about the classification of our crop plants, and let's start by looking at their place of origin. There are two competing theories on this. There is Vavilov's theory of the center of origin, which says that crops evolved where they are showing the greatest variation in their genetics and species. He thinks that this is the center of origin, and I would say that this idea is the current reigning champion and most widely held idea, and we all pretty much think that this is correct. Where there is the greatest variation, that is where that crop evolved. And so Vavilov identified 8 centers on the globe that are the origin of crop plants. And I'm going to show you next the origins and a sample crop from each. This is by no means an exhaustive list of all the crops. So on the left-hand column, we see the center of origin, the 8, and on the right, we see an example from that center of origin where these crops evolved. Now, we're not saying that Vavilov's not saying they evolved in the same town, but they evolved in the same region. So there's China, which the example is soybean, India, which is rice. Most people think rice came from Asia, and India is in Asia, but they think it came from China or Japan, but in fact it's Indian. Central Asia is the origin of wheat and a lot of our other important grains. The Middle East is known for alfalfa and some small grains. The Mediterranean gave us a lot, including white clover. Africa gave us a lot. Eastern Africa, specifically Ethiopia, gave us sorghum and the most important one, coffee. Central America gave us corn, but almost every country in the world calls what we call corn, they call it maize, right? But we call it corn. And then South America gave us the Irish potato. Do you see North America on that? North America is not considered to be a center of origin for very many crops. It's not a major contributor to global food. You also don't see Australia on there. You also don't see Europe on there. The competing theory was by an American crop scientist, very important and well-respected scientist. He had the theory, the non-center of origin theory, which said that plants don't have a single center of origin, but they develop at multiple locations at the same time. Now, this has generally been agreed upon that this is not there's not much evidence for this, and this is the way science works, right? There's two competing ideas, and we look at the preponderance of evidence and say, well, if the preponderance of evidence is in favor of one over the other, then we choose the one that's most supported. In this case, it is Vavilov, his single origin of evolution theory. So more people subscribe, in fact, most people subscribe to Vavilov's theory of our crop plants, and so we will too. Now, if we look on a global map of where our crops originate, there are contributions made from more than 8 regions, and certainly North America is well represented, but just not a major center of origin. But let's look at the crop contributions let's look at the upper left-hand corner for North America. That's the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Plums, American species of grapes. blueberries, cranberries, pecan, sunflower, certain type of bean. I would also add persimmon and pawpaws. And there are a few others, but we can slip down to Mesoamerica, which is Central America, and we see maize. There's corn. Most of the world calls it maize. Tomato from Guatemala. A certain kind of bean, a scarlet runner bean. Avocado, papaya. Cacao is chocolate. Cassava, sweet potato, and common bean. I left off naming cotton because you'll see cotton is represented in 5 places on the planet. So we're not sure if cotton is a very important crop, and it may have been spread around early on, and we're still maybe trying to figure out where exactly is that center of origin. But we have figured it out for a lot of the other ones. If we look at the highlands of South America, that's the Andes Mountains. Potato, peanut, lima bean, named for Lima, Peru, the capital of Peru. Common bean and possibly cotton. I will say that I have seen wild cotton growing on a volcano, on the edge of a volcano in the Galapagos Islands, and not much is growing there. It's a lot of lava, and then there was a cotton plant growing there. If we go up to Europe, Europe makes a little bit of contribution. Oats, sugar beet, rye, cabbage. Africa comes in with African rice, sorghum, a couple of millets, yam. Not the same yam as the lowlands of South America. Generally, that's going to be Brazil. Cowpeas and coffee. I skipped the lowland South America, but that's going to be a different type of yam. And pineapples, right? And if we look at the Near East, Iraq, Iran, in current those countries there today, we see wheat, barley, onion, pea, lentil, chickpea, figs, dates. Dates come from a palm, date palm, flax, pears, and pomegranates. It's a fairly small area, but it packs quite a big punch. And then we can work our way around and see that China is soybean and even peaches. You may think of peaches as being a very southern crop in the United States, but it originated certainly in China. And then we can go around and we can look at the South Pacific. Australia gives us macadamia nuts, etc. Now, depending on where a species is grown and where you are, a species could be native or indigenous, means the same thing, means it originated in that region. So we have some native grasses here. We have switchgrass and big bluestem and eastern gamagrass, and those are crops, and those are forage crops. Animals eat those crops, or we might hay those crops. They're native to North America prairies, okay? And they would be indigenous. Or we could say maybe they're native not to Kentucky, but maybe to North America. Or we might say something is native to the Western Hemisphere, getting even broader in scope. The Western Hemisphere includes North, Central, and South America. And so if something is native to Brazil, we might say, well, it's native to this hemisphere. Okay, there's some examples there. And then the opposite of native is exotic or introduced or non-native, kind of the same idea. And it's that these originated in a different area where it's being grown now. Okay, doesn't mean it's bad, doesn't mean it's good, just means that it's not native to where it's being grown now. But I will tell you there are a lot of plants that you might think are native to the U.S. that are not, including or animals. 2 great examples are the earthworm and the honeybee, but there's a lot more. Most of our crops in the U.S. now, I'm going to make this distinction here, the United States, we grow tobacco, corn, fescue, wheat, alfalfa, peppers, tomatoes, soybeans, potatoes. None of those crops are native to the United States. So on the test question, if I ask you, most of the crops grown in the United States are exotic, the answer's true. That's a true statement. Okay. We can classify plants based on ways that we use them. There's a small category or a small way of talking about them called a lifesaver crop, and most of the world depends on crops which many of us have either not seen or maybe not even heard of. We've probably heard of most of them, but we have seen them. You have to have a lot of carbohydrates in your diet. You have to have some protein in your diet. Much of the world lives on just a few plants, mostly a carbohydrate source. So what are these lifesaver crops? Well, it depends on where you are and what you're able to grow, right? Just take a look at this list. How many do you know? How many have you heard of? Okay, so certainly wheat, rice, corn, potato, yes. Barley, yes. Some of these you may not have heard of or not realize. Oranges. Maybe you don't know much about yams, or you think you know about yams, right? You've probably heard of most of these on the list, though. Maybe you're not sure what millet is. If you've never eaten a mango, you've really missed out. It's a wonderful fruit. But these are the lifesaver crops. Most of them do not even grow in the United States. Certainly they're not native to the United States. Or we could classify plants, and this is a kind of a cartoon pointing out what a small grain is not. Okay, well, let's move ahead, and we can talk about not seeds anymore, but we can talk about leaves and stems, because sometimes we just harvest the leaves and stems of plants, and that's called a forage. It's the vegetative, not the sexual. The sexual would be the seeds. This is the vegetative portion of plants, and we feed them either fresh or we preserve them in various ways. But these are fed to animals, cows generally, but sometimes hogs or poultry or others. Of course, you're probably familiar with hay. Kentucky's one of the leading hay-producing states in the country. This is herbage or plant material that's cut and cured down to about 20%. Doing a lot of that in the late summer at various times during the summer. You'll see farmers going out and cutting hay. It lays out there for a day or two. They'll come through and flip it with the thing they pull behind the tractor that flips it. And then once it's down to about 20% or so, they will bale it up and store it to be fed later. If it's harvested above 20%, it can catch fire, and barns burn down occasionally because the hay was harvested at too high of a moisture content. On the other hand, if you let it lay out there for too long and it rains on it, a lot of the nutritional value will be lost because it'll dissolve in the rain and go back into the soil, and so you'll be feeding your animals less than ideal hay through the winter. So it's a dried product. Haylage, on the other hand, is a high moisture hay, and it's fermented to preserve it, not unlike sauerkraut or pickles. This is to be fed, and it's a little fresher, maybe a little more nutritious for the animals to eat. And then there's silage, and silage is where a farmer will chop, let's say, corn especially, or sorghum, which is high in water content and real stalky with big leaves, so it's real succulent and wet, and they will put it in a silo or some container and exclude oxygen from it. That means anaerobic, that's without oxygen. And it will ferment and stink and smell, but it is like sauerkraut. And then that material can be fed to cattle in the dead of winter, especially in the northern states where the cows don't even go outside for months at a time because it's cold. There's a lot of snow on the ground. They can't eat anyway. And it's a really nice way to preserve the nutritional profile of this very nutritious and green plant material in the dead of winter, and keeps the cows happy and productive. And then there's green chop, and green chop is just what it sounds like. You just chop it up and feed it right there. Right? You don't preserve it, you don't let it dry, just a green chop, chop and feed. It's like a salad bar. We can also break up these crops into specific uses. For instance, a companion crop or two or more crops that are grown at the same time. They both contribute some value to the cropping system. Maybe one is a legume fixing nitrogen, and it's helping the other crop, which may be lettuce or kale or something that likes a lot of nitrogen to grow. That would be a nice companion crop. A sugar crop is a crop where you're harvesting either sugar cane or usually sugar beets from a crop, and those are two very different crops. One is related to spinach and one's a big grass. So we just call them sugar crops. Oil crops could be a lot of plants, could be peanuts, safflower, sunflower, sesame. If it's grown for oil, we call it an oil crop. If a crop is grown to stop the erosion of soil, bare soil from rain and wind, we call that a cover crop. if we grow a plant on the soil and then don't wait for it to die on its own, but then plow it under while it's still green, that's called a green manure crop. That contributes a lot of organic matter to the soil, helps to break up tight soils and allow water infiltration into soil that increases the organic matter of soils. There's a lot of plants, hundreds if not thousands of plants that we grow that are or go out and find in the forest that are drug producers or medicinal somehow. And so tobacco can be grown as a crop for human consumption, and we also transform tobacco to grow pharmaceuticals. And so if it's grown that way, it would be grown as a drug or a medicinal. We can grow tuberous crops. Tuberous crops are like tulips or Irish potatoes. Tubers are stem tissues that grow underground, and they're usually storage tissues, and they store carbohydrates that we harvest and eat or maybe grow as an ornamental. And then there are root crops we can grow, for instance, the carrot. These grow underground also, but they're a storage tissue exclusively. And I would say that carrot is no doubt the best example of root crops. We can also break crops up, and talk about even entire cropping systems. We've got two main cropping systems that we use. One is a monoculture system, which is not considered to be ideal. This is growing the same crop on the same piece of land year after year after year. Generally, if you do this, the yield declines over time for a lot of reasons. Plant pathogens, that is diseases, build up in the soil. They can harbor bad insects. The soil can harbor bad insects that can key in on the same crop coming in over and over and over. One crop tends to use a certain profile of nutrients out of the soil that's hard to replace. And then also sometimes plants just simply put chemicals into their soil. It kind of poisons it a little bit, and over time it even stops its own or inhibits its own growth. Generally, if you monocrop, yields will go down over time. It's not considered to be very good. The better solution is multiple cropping, more than one crop on the same piece of land, maybe from year to year to year. So year one, you grow corn, year two, soybeans, year three, wheat, back to the year one cycle. So a 3-year rotating cycle, something like that would be ideal. But sometimes we do double cropping in Kentucky, where we can grow wheat and then pull it off quickly and put a soybean crop on there and get it off quickly and double the crops on that land. We can divide plants up into life cycles. I'm going to ask you this question on every exam that you have with me this semester in this class, so you may as well learn what an annual, a biennial, and a perennial are. So an annual is a plant that completes its life cycle, that is going from seed to seed in one growing season. It doesn't mean one calendar year, but it might. One growing season, all right? And I'm going to skip this next category, spring annual. I want you to know summer annual and winter annual. Okay, those are the two I want you to know for annuals. A summer annual is a plant that germinates in the spring after the last frost and grows and tries to set seed before the killing frost in the fall. So these are hot weather plants, corn, soybean, sorghum, for instance. Okay. And then there's another type called a winter annual, which is very interesting. A winter annual is planted in the fall, grows leaves and stems, hunkers down over winter, needs the cooling, needs the cold treatment. We call it a chilling treatment, needs that cold treatment or chilling treatment to transform its growing point from growing more leaves and stems, which is vegetative, into a sexual mode, which would be growing grain, like wheat, for instance. That process of chilling is called vernalization. Vernal meaning spring, so it's like the springization of it. It has to undergo a cold winter, and then when the environmental signals are right, it will go ahead and flower and set seed. Very interesting. Now, we can have biennials. And a biennial is a plant that takes exactly, no more and no less, exactly 2 growing seasons to complete its life cycle, seed to seed. So whereas an annual has 1 growing season, a biennial has 2. Carrots, celery, lettuce, cabbage, beets, Brussels sprouts, Swiss chard, and a lot of other vegetables that we grow, you may be surprised to know that they are in fact biennials. Let's take carrots. Carrots grow a big root in year 1, and then they undergo the cooling, the chilling, the vernalization of the winter, and then they grow reproductively in year 2. We don't let our carrots really grow into year 2. We harvest them. We harvest that stored carbohydrate out of the ground after year 1. But if you've ever left carrots in the ground, forgotten about them, or didn't get them all harvested, you'll know the next year you've got big white flowers in the garden, and that would be carrots. But this is also true for cabbage and beets and Brussels sprouts as well. That's a biennial, exactly 2 years. Year 1 is vegetative and year 2 is reproductive. And then finally we can have perennials, and a perennial is simply a plant that survives more than 2 growing seasons. Okay? These plants can be produced by seed, they can be produced by cuttings, it doesn't really matter as long as it lives more than 2 growing seasons. So perennials, clovers live a long time, alfalfa lives a long time, alfalfa can live 100 years. Tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, trees and shrubs. Okay, asparagus patches can grow for decades and decades and decades. Okay, these are perennial, they come back year after year. Well, we can also break plants up and divide them into the stem characteristics, like herbaceous means non-woody. Okay, it means fleshy, non-woody, or even woody. So that would be a tree or a shrub. Herbaceous would be like wheat or daylilies or grass. It just doesn't make woody material in the stem, but a tree and a shrub would, and that would become woody. We can also talk about the stem growth habit. We can classify plants based on whether it's erect, that is, it grows straight up out of the ground. Corn, alfalfa, soybean, tobacco, they grow right away from earth, striving to reach the sun. But we can also have decumbent plants, which kind of sprawl on the ground, peanuts and white clover. And then we can have creeping plants that actually don't, peanuts and white clover grow up a little bit, but then kind of fall over. Creeping plants like strawberries don't even grow up at all. They just creep along the ground. Or we could say something is climbing, like tomatoes or morning glories or grapes that use tendrils to climb. So we can classify plants based on stem growth habit. And we can also finally classify plants based on their climatic adaptation. So we can divide them up into cool season and warm season. A cool season plant or crop grows in the cool, moist time of the year. Alfalfa, timothy, fescue, wheat, oats, orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass, for instance. They like it when it's cool outside. They do not like the heat and the drought of summer, and they do not survive. And then we can have warm season crops or plants which are adapted to hot and dry weather. They like it from 65 to 90. Above 90, nothing likes it really above 90, but 65 to 90 is good for them. Corn, sorghum, millet, switchgrass, Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, date palms, orchids. These are all plants that like warm season adaptations. So that's the last slide of this presentation. We have looked at how we can organize and classify crop plants several different ways based on their growing cycle, how many years they grow, how many seasons, what kind of season they grow in, where they're from, how we use them. There's a lot of ways that we can talk about how to use crop plants.